Honorable Senators, I also rise to speak on Bill C-45, an act respecting cannabis. Before I begin, I would like to thank every senator who has contributed to this expansive debate on Bill C-45 to best create a safe, fair, and well-regulated cannabis market in Canada. Specifically, I want to thank Senator Dean for his hard work and Senator Eggleton and his social committee for the hard work they have done on this bill. They really helped us really narrow the issues, and I want to thank them. I will not repeat many of the issues that have been raised, since they have each been discussed here at great length. I would like to add my voice to the discussion on how Bill C-45 will affect Canada's border with the United States. With that said, instead of talking about it in terms of trade or our diplomatic relations, I would like to take a different approach. Instead, I would like to address the fact that Canada seriously needs a massive education campaign on what is and is not legal as Canadians cross our border with the US. It is no understatement to say that many Canadians do not know about what will be legal in the US after Bill C-45 is passed. In fact, I get questions about this subject from British Columbians practically every day. Some wonder if they can consume cannabis in states where it is legal, like in Washington state. Others wonder if they can bring cannabis over the border to enjoy it with their friends in these states, in the states where it's legal to have cannabis. Every time I hear these questions, I get more concerned. Many Canadians just do not know about our most basic laws involving possessing and consuming cannabis in the US. This is unacceptable. Above all else, we must communicate the following clearly. Cannabis may be legal here in Canada when this bill is passed. It may be legal in some US states like Washington state. However, as long as it remains illegal at the federal level in the United States, consuming and possessing marijuana across the border will have serious consequences. In most cases, violating these laws will immediately have you barred from the United States for life. If you want to return to the United States after you've been barred, it's a very long process. You have to apply for waiver, which is very expensive and time-consuming. Honorable Senators, I know you will agree with me that we must not let this happen to Canadians. For many British Columbians, being barred from the US would be devastating. Crossing over the border is almost a way of life for many British Columbians. Just to give you an idea of how many British Columbians cross the border, the Peace Arch border crossing in Surrey, BC, is the third busiest in all of Canada, with over 4,800 cars crossing it every day to travel between Seattle and Vancouver. These people rely on being able to cross into the US for almost everything. It is their means of visiting their friends and family or finding places to go shopping and eat. For British Columbians, it is even essential for their careers. They proudly represent Canada across the United States manufacturing, healthcare, education, and science sectors, and at university. If British Columbians are banned, or some of the people are banned from the United States, they will have to completely change their lifestyles. Our government must be proactive to ensure that Canadians know the law on cross-border crossings. Despite this serious need for an education campaign, our government is not taking the proper steps to ensure that Canadians are properly informed. At Defense Committee, when I asked the officials from Canadian Border Services Agency about what our government intends to do to educate Canadians about what they will face at the border, they only told me about a signage campaign for airports which will be implemented by the spring of 2019. Honorable Senators, I say to you, that is too late. Worse yet, we heard almost nothing as far as campaigns outside of airports are concerned. In other words, thousands of British Columbians who cross our land border every day would get absolutely no information. This is simply not good enough. If Canadians have questions about these laws, then it is the government's duty to ensure that they have answers. Unfortunately, all that Canadians have now are contradictory answers. For example, according to the government, if you are honest about your past cannabis use with border officials, after Bill C-45 is passed, the worst anyone will deal with is being turned away from the border. It's not just that you are turned away from the border, you are barred for life from entering the US. However, according to witnesses who appeared before the Standing Committee on National Security and Defense, there is a high chance that Canadians will be barred for life from the US if they answer honestly. This lack of clarity worries me a lot. I'm worried that Canadians can easily find themselves barred from the US because we are failing to educate them about a set of drug laws that are incredibly complex. To put the complexity of these laws into perspective, I would like to list a few things that could have Canadians barred from entering the US for life. If you admit to having consumed cannabis in the past, you could be barred from the United States for life. If you decide to work with the legal Canadian cannabis business, you could be barred from the US and detained for association with drug trafficking. If you publicly state that you have used cannabis on television or on social media, you could be barred for life. If you go through pre-clearance, you can be compelled to answer about your previous cannabis usage and be banned for life based on your answer. In fact, you can even be barred for just being related to someone that has committed a drug offense, since you would be considered a beneficiary of drug trafficking. None of this is immediately obvious for Canadians right now. Our Defense Committee only learned about this after hearing from experts with a wealth of knowledge on this issue. With this in mind, I would like for you all to imagine how difficult it would be for most Canadians. In all likelihood, they will never know about any of these laws, and this is simply unacceptable. If Canadians are going to be subjected to such risk, then they must be educated about it before crossing our southern border. I would like to share one particularly worrisome incident to show how serious this could be for Canadians. In 1998, Ross Rebagalti made Canada proud when he won the Olympic gold medal for snowboarding. However, after returning home, he learned that he was barred for life from entering the United States. When he asked why he had been barred, Ross learned that because he had admitted to having smoked cannabis on Jay Leno show. To this day, Ross has to apply for a waiver regularly. I think at the moment he has a waiver to enter the United States for a period of 3 years. But on a regular basis, he has to apply for permission to enter the United States. So just talking about it once had him barred from entering the country for the rest of his life. This is what Canadians risk when they cross the border after Bill C-45 is passed into law. Thankfully, this problem can be addressed without amending Bill C-45, so I will not be tabling an amendment. Instead, I'm urging the government to undertake a sweeping education campaign to ensure that all Canadians are informed about what they will face when they cross the border. We need this campaign now. Every day we fail to educate Canadians is a day where they could potentially experience trouble with American law enforcement and be barred for life from crossing the border. Canadians need to know that cannabis is illegal at the federal level in the United States, regardless of its legality here or in individual states. They need to know about the various complex laws that could have them barred from the US for life. They also need to know their rights. They need to know that they have options, like being able to walk away at a point of entry instead of answering questions. They may have been prevented from entering the US for that one time, but it's far better than being banned for life. Honorable Senators, while I support the provisions of Bill C-45, I urge you to join me in calling for the government to take a far more proactive stance now in ensuring that Canadians are informed about what they may face as they pass over our southern border. Cases like Ross's are not isolated incidents. When this came to the committee, we heard from several lawyers whose clients also experienced similar circumstances. Unless the government takes action now, more Canadians will be banned from the United States and be forced to change their lifestyles. It is not just a matter of changing lifestyles, it is a matter of not being able to see your relatives, as we all know that we all have relations across Canada and the US. I therefore urge our government to carry out an extensive educational campaign to inform Canadians that even if cannabis may be legal, for example, in British Columbia and Washington State, it is not legal at the US federal level. We must inform Canadians now. Thank you.
Senator Seidman on debate.
Thank you, Chair.
Speaker, sorry. Okay. Honourable Senators, I rise to speak to Bill C-45, an act respecting cannabis, and to amend the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the Criminal Code, and other acts at third reading. At the outset of our study, I expressed my concern that the government had failed to answer some fundamental questions about its rationale for legalizing marijuana. Despite some positive improvements advanced by Conservative senators, it is abundantly clear that Bill C-45 does not align with the government's claim that it is taking a public health approach, for the simple reason that cannabis legalization threatens the health and safety of Canadians. After hearing the evidence presented, it is difficult to understand why the government is doing this at all, and in such a drastic and irreversible way. Legalization should be a last resort if incremental approaches to address cannabis-related harms fail. Instead, the government has chosen to conduct a grand experiment on the Canadian public, an experiment which cannot be undone. I do not doubt that our existing cannabis laws unfairly penalize users, particularly among marginalized populations. I also have no doubt that large numbers of young people are already using marijuana today to their detriment. But it does not logically follow that the solution to these problems is to create a multi-billion-dollar predatory cannabis industry overnight, with the provinces taking on the role of drug dealer and the federal government taking its cut. The government claims that its policy choices are evidence-based, yet they appear to be decidedly disinterested in an incremental approach that would allow for information to be gathered. Canada is only the second country in the world, after Uruguay, to legalize marijuana, and we are sorely lacking in baseline data, despite a last-ditch effort by Statistics Canada to help us fully understand the health and safety impact of proceeding to full-scale legalization in one fell swoop. There was nothing stopping the government from bringing forward a comprehensive public education program when they were first elected in 2015 in order to prepare Canadians for legalization, but they didn't. Likewise, there was nothing standing in their way from decriminalizing small amounts of marijuana or pardoning those with past convictions, but they declined. The gradual introduction of cannabis liberalization policies would have allowed the government to act immediately, to address some of the negative aspects of our existing laws while gathering key data and educating the public. The government's failure to take an incremental approach can be explained in part by the fact that the government is not actually serious about reducing cannabis use, especially among adults. This became abundantly clear when I pressed Parliamentary Secretary Bill Blair on why the government had failed to set any targets to reduce the number of Canadians who use marijuana. He could not provide an answer, but a few weeks later, Health Canada belatedly announced that it would set targets to reduce the rate of cannabis use, but only among Canadians aged 15 to 24. Setting targets to reduce cannabis use among young people is a positive development, to be sure, but it lays bare the truth that the government expects the number of Canadian adult cannabis consumers to increase, and that it's perfectly comfortable with more people using the drug. It's inevitable, given the evidence that marijuana legalization contributes to the normalization of its use and sends the message that it's safe. Moreover, the frequency of use among existing cannabis users will increase, which is the greatest predictor of harm. A new report from Deloitte estimates that after legalization, cannabis users will buy marijuana more often than they do today and spend as much as 68% more on their purchases. This projection aligns with empirical evidence from other jurisdictions that cannabis liberalization policies, including legalization, lead to increased frequency and intensity of use among existing users. Health Canada officials, experts from the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, and the Canadian Centre for Substance Abuse, just to name a few, acknowledge that frequent cannabis users are most vulnerable to its harms. There are serious doubts that legalization is the path to harm reduction. Yet, by enabling a multi-billion-dollar, profit-driven industry, already a powerful lobby in its own right, the government has tied the hands of future lawmakers if and when its experiment fails. The Leader of the Opposition in the Senate spoke yesterday in this chamber about how critical aspects of legalization, those with the greatest impact on the health and safety of Canadians, have been relegated to the regulatory process. Many questions related to packaging, promotion, and product potency will be decided in regulations, leaving senators with little assurance that the appropriate safeguards will be put in place. I'm heartened that the Social Affairs Committee accepted my amendment to require that future regulations for new classes of cannabis, such as edibles and vaping products, be brought before Parliament for review. But it does not change the fact that regulatory decisions with the greatest impact on public health have been far from transparent. The rapid commercialization of the industry should also give us pause when considering the bill's discretionary powers with respect to advertising. We know that cannabis companies will make every effort to circumvent restrictions on product promotion, which is why 5 public health organizations in Canada, including the Chief Medical Officers of Health, the Canadian Public Health Association, the Canadian Medical Association, the Canadian Pediatric Society, and the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health, all recommend a complete ban on advertising. This is yet another example of a government which claims it is taking a public health approach, ignoring the advice of every leading public health organization in the country. Last week, a majority of senators in this chamber voted to close a loophole that gives cannabis companies a backdoor to advertise marijuana. Among the bill's partial restrictions, it contained an exception that would have allowed cannabis manufacturers to produce T-shirts, hats, iPhone cases, and other products displaying their brand logos. This practice is known as brand stretching, or backdoor branding, and is clearly at odds with the government's stated goal of protecting public health. Without a ban, clothing and other promotional items emblazoned with cannabis company logos will be seen by young people, and they will send the message that marijuana is safe. They're a form of advertising, plain and simple, which Bill C-45 purports to ban. With restrictions on other forms of marketing, companies will inevitably spend their advertising dollars on these products. We know this because it happened with tobacco, and it's already happening with cannabis. Since this chamber passed the amendment, it's no surprise that the cannabis industry has voiced their opposition, but they are crying wolf. Companies can differentiate their products through branded packaging, branded cannabis accessories, and in-store informational product displays. Highly regulated distribution through select retailers gives these companies a captive market, and they don't need any help from backdoor branding to sell more marijuana. We would do very well to remember our decades-long fight with big tobacco to get Joe Camel and other cigarette logos out of sight. Over 70 countries have outlawed brand stretching for tobacco in accordance with the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. The practice is effectively banned in Canada by a patchwork of provincial restrictions, but these victories for public health were hard-won. We have a golden opportunity to learn from past mistakes. Legalization offers a blank canvas, and lobbying from the cannabis industry is only getting stronger. Producers have not been shy about their plans to creatively exploit the advertising restrictions in the bill. A ban on backdoor branding responds to this threat with best public health practices. When Bill C-45 is returned to the other place, the government should accept the Senate's amendments. When a majority of senators identify a loophole that contradicts the purpose of legislation, we are serving our purpose as a chamber of sober second thought. If the government's motivation for legalizing marijuana is truly about public health as opposed to profit, they will accept the amendment to close the backdoor branding loophole, along with the many other important improvements to the bill brought forward by senators from all parties and groups. Despite assurances of review, I remain deeply concerned that legalization will set us down a path from which it will be impossible to return. Jonathan Calkins, an internationally renowned drug policy researcher, had this to say about the future of commercial cannabis legalization, and I quote, "There's a good chance that people in 25 to 40 years will look back and shake their heads and ask, 'What were you thinking? Why did you think it was a good idea to create an industry of titans to market this drug?'" As we prepare to vote at third reading and send the bill back to the other place, we must ask ourselves if we have done all that we can do to safeguard Canadians from an untested policy and a profit-hungry market. Thank you.
Senators, I'm going to interrupt this for a little minute or two because we've received a message from the House of Commons. Honourable Senators, a message has been received from the House of Commons with Bill C-74 entitled An Act to Implement Certain Provisions of the Budget tabled in Parliament on February 27, 2018, to which they desire the concurrence of the Senate. When shall this bill be read a second time? It is moved by the Honourable Senator Harder, seconded by the Honourable Senator Bellemare. This bill be placed on the orders of the day for second reading 2 days hence. Is it your pleasure, Honourable Senators, to adopt the motion? Carried. Senator McCallum, on debate.
Do I have the hammer? Honourable Senators, First Nations, Inuit and Métis continue to live under abusive and unsafe conditions that have become commonplace and constant. Situations that were at one time rare, such as muggings and gang activities, are now ordinary in our communities. As the majority of us have lived our entire lives under occupation by federal laws and policies, in our own country, no less, there is the stark realization that instability and insecurity have been routine for the last 150 years. The ongoing violence, born of poverty and policy, that make Indigenous peoples unable to meet basic needs, including health care, is termed structural violence and is indeed a source of trauma. Often, these structural induced traumas go unnoticed until sudden events graphically expose what has existed all along. Bill C-45 has graphically exposed to me the dominance and power of criminalization that has oftentimes commandeered Indigenous lives. Historically, colleagues, our communities were places of safety where people felt protected and supported. As people who lived with and on the land, we were pushed to our limits, limits that challenged and brought out the best in us. My parents and their peers accomplished great things, and they were good providers who were well equipped with intelligence, sound work ethics, and who also did well to pass on traditional life skills. The law reached them in the far north with the arrival of the policy of residential schools. In the politically structured poor reserves, which are tightly and legally bound to our beloved Canada, a rich and democratic country, laws continue to be generated that are quite literally fatal. The policies and systems imposed on these reserves are the foundation and guiding light that leads Indigenous peoples through their comparably short lives, frequently concluding in premature deaths. Laws continue to isolate us, and it is in this isolation that we are most vulnerable. Laws have the ability to silence people, especially those who have had their voices taken away within a largely patriarchal society. These same laws also silence those who have no privilege or influence over the very legislation that shaped their lives. Laws continue to determine our lives and frequently result in the criminalization of Indigenous peoples, whether men, women, or youth, at a prohibitive rate. Honorable Senators, making laws that criminalize social problems, such as the possession of cannabis, is not sustainable. It is no longer palatable to accept whatever we are told about limited resources at face value. The limited resources to which I refer, colleagues, are those that are required to address the effects of colonization, which create high burden areas in our communities. What then is not sustainable? I would argue conversely that it is the opposition to spending and committing resources in high burden areas that is not sustainable. The wealth of Canada has not dried up. It simply remains unavailable to those who need it most. As Indigenous peoples, we have experienced the slashing of funding under previous administrations from which we are still recuperating. When I was working in the field in the last 15 years, many of the Indigenous organizations were slashed by 50%. And there was no one that came forward and asked about our resources at that time. As parliamentarians, our challenge is not only to draw attention to the effects of the ever-widening gap in criminalization that exists between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, but to dissect it and to work with all our capacity to reduce this gap. I ask, are unequal standards in criminalization to be accepted as a fact of life for certain segments of the population in Canada? Honorable Senators, through the course of our lives, Indigenous peoples have tried to make sense of the trauma that we have been forced to go through. The senior citizen in me today insists that social problems should not be criminalized, but rather that these social problems are treatable through the use and deployment of appropriate resources. Yet prisons and juvenile detention centers remain Canada's leading answer for Indigenous peoples and the issue they face. Amartya Sen has observed that the first question in any critical examination of equality is, equality of what? In the examination of inequalities in the representation of our incarcerated population, why are Indigenous peoples more likely to end up in prisons and juvenile detention centers, while others are more likely to be spared this fate? What creates and maintains such disparities, which are largely socially determined? Colleagues, the act of smoking marijuana should not depend on the fear that one can be incarcerated, but rather on the freedom of decision-making. Poverty, intergenerational trauma, and shame are already great limiting factors of freedom for many Indigenous people. We already know that many youth who are incarcerated for smoking marijuana do so in spite of having enough information on the subject. Rather, they need guidance and development of their critical thinking skills so they can make these safe and informed decisions for themselves. Where social and political conditions determine the risk of criminalization, the knowledge, compassion, and wisdom of us as parliamentarians can fundamentally alter and potentially mitigate this risk. Honorable Senators, sober second thought does not end with the passing of legislation. We have the responsibility to convey information and advice on what is best for the lives of all Canadians. Sober second thought is not punitive. It is transformative. Sober second thought understands that conflict is normal in human relationships, and also that conflict, when harnessed appropriately, can be an effective motor of change. Sober second thought should advocate nonviolence as a way of conduct in both life and work. The elders in my community practiced sober second thought, and I remember asking them questions as a young adult, and they didn't answer me immediately. They talked about it the next night, and then the next night it wasn't like an immediate answer. So that's where I had already learned about sober second thought. Throughout my dialogue in this chamber of sober second thought, I have leaned heavily on the use of intellect and reflection to steer my thoughts and the musings that I have expressed to you. At no time was I co-opted by anyone else's agenda. I hold Indigenous peoples close to me. I would not sell out their interests, as I and my fellow Indigenous senators have been inappropriately accused of doing. Hear, hear. Colleagues, terrible things happened to me and those I loved while in residential school, and it affected how I parented and how I reacted to society in general. Due to my ingrained inability and fear to think for myself, I walked out the doors of residential school totally unprepared for society and everything it encompassed. I was vulnerable. Frankly, I am lucky to be alive today and lucky that I have never been incarcerated. It is this vulnerability because people are unable to make decisions for themselves. They have not been given the skills, and that's what our children lack. And I can't do that to our children. I stand here today and admit that I once turned to alcohol for a period of my life. Okay, where is it? This is not a simple or easy subject to broach. But in the end, I understood through my elders' teaching and role modeling that I did not want to hold on to the anger of my past, and what I really needed was help. This was my journey of self-discovery to travel, harmless to the outside world, so that I could learn from the many challenges I faced. It is a journey that many Indigenous people need to take to deal with personal and intergenerational trauma, and should not be preempted by fear of criminalization. What do I want for Indigenous youth? To carry a sense of authenticity and belonging with them rather than looking for it in external places. I want for them to have the courage to be imperfect, vulnerable, and creative. Do not fear feeling ashamed or unlovable if they are different or struggling, and to move through our rapidly changing world with courage and a resilient spirit. That is the world we need to create for our youth, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike. So, colleagues, I come back to the question which I posed at the outset of my speech. Do I have the hammer? Yes, I do. I always have, and I will continue to wield it in a way that I believe will best serve all Canadians, including the underrepresented and seldom heard Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Senator Lovelace Nicholas.
Thank you, Speaker. I would like to speak to Bill C-45. Although I am supporting the bill, I am skeptical of the government's word as outlined in their letter of intent concerning Indigenous consultation. I do not agree to a one-year delay as it concerns Indigenous people because First Nations would have been left out on another opportunity for self-sufficiency. Historically, Canada has not done proper consultation with First Nations. It is my fear that First Nations may be held back from getting licensed to sell cannabis. On the point of ticketing, the RCMP holds random checks at the entrance of First Nations communities. Will this change if and when First Nations get the same rights to sell cannabis? Under treaty, First Nations in their own territories or dwellings are free to fish, hunt, trade, grow, and farm medicine to sustain their livelihood. Government tends to ignore these facts. First Nations have three entities that have held them back from succeeding to enjoy the same rights to the resources of this land: the federal government, provinces, and Indigenous affairs. If I may, I'd like to quote from a few famous people on cannabis. My first, and I quote, John Adams, I quote, "We shall by and by want a world of hemp more for our own consumption," end of quote. Another quote from Thomas Jefferson, and I quote, "Hemp is the first necessity to wealth and protection of our country," end of quote. Lastly, quote from General George Washington, I quote, quote, make the most you can of Indian hemp seeds and sow it everywhere," end of quote. Honorable Senators, I want to thank all the members of Indigenous Affairs Committee for the work and many months on the very important bill, and I believe we accomplished what we wanted. In unity, William.
Senator Dick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to make a few comments to reinforce my speeches at the report stage of the bill a week ago and my speech last night specifically on Indigenous issues with respect to Bill C-45 concerning cannabis. Senators, we are engaged in a historic debate on Bill C-45, the cannabis bill. Our committees have done a thorough study, and our debate here in the chamber has been extensive and thorough, with many more amendments being proposed, debated, and accepted or not. Like many other senators, my major concerns have been on the effects of cannabis on youth. With Indigenous youth, there is potential for increased mental health harms from cannabis use. At the Aboriginal Peoples Committee hearings on Bill C-45, 2 witnesses told us that there is an increased risk for psychosis and schizophrenia in traumatized individuals. Colleagues, we all know that there are remote and northern Indigenous communities that suffer intergenerational trauma resulting from abuse suffered in Indian residential schools. Because of this and for other reasons, the Aboriginal Peoples Committee recommended initially a delay of up to a year in order for the government to commit to addressing the current critical mental health needs of Indigenous communities and to commit to ensuring that funds and treatment facilities be made available for the additional mental health needs that will likely arise from Bill C-45. As indicated yesterday, Ministers Philpott and Petitpot Taylor have committed to address the concerns raised by the Aboriginal Peoples Committee, and all of the Indigenous senators have also agreed that the letter covers what we were concerned about. I was particularly assured by their commitment, that meaning the ministers, to work closely with Indigenous communities and to ensure that additional resources are designated for mental health and addictions in Indigenous communities. More importantly, all of the Indigenous senators agreed that the commitments made by the ministers obviated the need to amend the bill in order to delay its enactment, as the objectives have been met by the commitments from the ministers. Honourable Senators, the debate in the Chamber on Bill C-45 has been thorough and for the most part respectful of the varying perspectives. Last night, however, I was taken aback by the comments of Senator Stuart Olson. The impact of her comments was immediate. I felt attacked personally because of the tone of her words. They were undeniably condescending and personal in nature, rather than neutral, thoughtful comments addressed to the substance of my speech. You'll get your turn, Senator Platt. Order.
Colleagues, Senator Dick has the floor. If anybody else wishes to enter the debate, I'll put their name on the list. Senator Dick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe that her comments were unparliamentary, personal, sharp, and taxing. Her comments were objectionable. I will not, at this time, raise a point of privilege, though I think that it would be successful. But I want my concerns to be noted. Senator Stuart Olson said that she was troubled by the, and I quote, the seeming capitulation to the government, end of quote, and that she was troubled because she thought that we, as the Aboriginal Peoples Committee,
on a point of order,
Point of order. Yes, Senator Martin.
I just want to point out the fact that Senator Dick was not on the original list that was submitted. And after speaking, like Senator Lovelace Nicholas spoke, and so to have Senator Dick speak right immediately after, it does disrupt the list only because there are many senators waiting. So I was just asking whether or not this was considered in calling on Senator Dick to speak next.
Yeah, I was just following the list that I have here, and it doesn't seem to me that it's going back and forth, which is the usual practice, but it just happens to be the list that I was handed, Senator Martin. Senator Dick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Senators, I'll repeat that last part since I was interrupted. Senator Stuart Olson said that she was troubled by, and I quote, the seeming capitulation to the government, end of quote, and that she was troubled because she thought we, the Aboriginal Peoples Committee, had the hammer to delay the bill. Colleagues, the Indigenous centres were able to use this so-called hammer in a way that was not necessarily delaying Bill C-45. We, the Indigenous senators, did not drop the hammer. We used it judiciously, and we used this hammer in a precise and focused action with great aim, and achieved our objectives without causing undue collateral damage that a delay would precipitate. I thank Senator Sinclair for stating last night his objections to Senator Stuart Olson's words. Colleagues, Senator Stuart Olson did apologize to me last night, but at the time, I did not recognize how condescending her comments were. When I read the transcript this morning, I realized how disrespectful her comments were. They were partisan rather than thoughtful and insightful. Finally, as I said a few minutes ago, I will not raise a point of privilege, but I did want my objections to Senator Stuart Olson's language to be recorded. Colleagues, let us remember Peter, Paul, and Mary, the Peter, Paul, and Mary song. If I had a hammer, I would hammer out danger. I'd hammer out a warning. I'd hammer out love between my brothers and my sisters all over this land. Senator Stuart Olson's intervention last night has not changed my position on Bill C-45. I will support the passage of Bill C-45 as amended. Thank you.
Senator Dagenet.
Alors, merci, Monsieur.
Senator Dagenet, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to tell you how much I am troubled by the debate that is ongoing this week. I am troubled to see to which point we've all played a role, our respective roles in a masquerade or a Greek tragedy with the god of pathos as the protagonist. The result of the vote that I anticipate on C-45, after all the work accomplished in the committees and in this place, will highlight unprecedented acts of political blindness, all that to please a politician who promised legalizing pot in Canada. We have worked hard, you and I, to gain perspective on this bill. We did our duty, despite the little time that was given to us for a societal bill as important as this one. Today, I am therefore troubled to see how many of you have given such little credence to the testimony of doctors, experts, police officers, victims, and politicians who all came to talk to us about the serious consequences that will stem from the passing of Bill C-45 as proposed by the current Liberal government. I am truly troubled to see that you are ready to dismiss these opinions, especially my colleagues across the way, out of fickle partisanship. I say this because I don't believe for an instant that you have all together at the same time lost the independence that you claim to have. I will come back to this in a few moments. I am also troubled when I see that our chamber is ready to disregard the constitutional rights of the provinces, a position that I qualify as indefensible among people as informed as you are. I am troubled to see how curtly you set aside the completely justified request by Aboriginal peoples to delay the legalization of marijuana by 1 year, when we are all aware, fully aware, of the problems that members of their community may face. It's quite a reconciliation, to use the word of the Prime Minister. I ask you the following question. Where is the urgency on this date of June 17th? Why is this government succeeding in making you act this way? You are certainly not naive enough to collectively, unanimously believe that it is for the good of Canadians that we will be legalizing marijuana. Before we vote, you all had the chance to weigh in on C-45 and on some of its components. I will therefore do a step back to tell you what was said on the other side of the chamber. Senators Dean, Gagné, Galvez, Lankin, Meiji, Moncion, and Wu all raised the issue tied to the impact of marijuana on the brain, as did doctors that we all heard from in committee. Senators Boniface, Dupuis, Galvez, Gold, and Pratt all raised the issue of THC rates in marijuana. And we heard experts who came to confirm this before us in committees. Senator Dean rightly questioned the impact of legalized marijuana on Aboriginal communities. First Nations all confirmed this before our committees. Senators Moncion and Lankin spoke about the issue of home production. Police officers confirmed that there was an issue before our committees. Senators Meiji, Petitclerc, and Wu supported, some of them even strongly, the idea of increasing the legal age for marijuana consumption. And finally, Senators Gagné, Galvez, Hartling, Lankin, Meiji, Moncion, Petitclerc, and Pratt all said at one point that there were gaps concerning awareness raising and education programs on marijuana. I'm looking at you, all of you, and ask you, what changes were made to Bill C-45 to address your concerns and apprehension, which was expressed so clearly? I don't see any changes. No major amendments. Why? Because you voted in the majority against these amendments. So my question today is whether you were asked or were you commanded to pass the legalization of marijuana as proposed? Because I think that's what happened. Where is your independence? Where is your ability to effect change? Where is the cohesiveness about that address your expressed fears? Was that all just swept under the rug? Now we need an intervention by the Holy Spirit or Saint Justin. I think today is an important moment for the credibility of the Senate and its senators. Some observers feel that our role would be to add value to this, that the Senate would gain credibility with this debate on C-45. What a shame. I think that by passing this bill, it will be a missed opportunity. And I hope that I don't live to see the day, to see the damages that it will have on our society. Thank you very much.
Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honorable Senators, the choice in front of us today is actually quite simple. Either we believe that the current system is working, which would lead us to vote against Bill C-45, or we think that a new approach is necessary. If we believe a new approach is needed, there are only two alternatives: decriminalization, which apparently is the choice of some of our friends opposite, or legalization, Bill C-45. However, when the Conservatives were last in government, there was absolutely no sign that they were contemplating decriminalization, even though the situation was as serious as it is today. Also, during this debate, the Conservatives have repeatedly asked for criminalization of possession by minors of less than 5 grams of cannabis. Therefore, I would argue, if the past is any indication of the future, the chances of decriminalization ever seeing the light of day are close to non-existent. So the choice before us is clear: the current system, prohibition, or legalization, C-45. 32%. That is the percentage of Canadians aged 20 to 24 who have used cannabis in the last 3 months. Think about this. 1 in 3 Canadians in their early 20s is a regular cannabis user. This after a century of prohibition and hundreds of thousands of criminal charges. In my view, this alone puts to rest any remaining debate on the effectiveness of prohibition. Nous voici donc devant le projet de loi C-45.
So here we are before Bill C-45. In my opinion, the main advantage of legalization has already been observed in recent months, and it is to allow openness for frank discussions at all levels of Canadian society, particularly among families and in schools, on cannabis use. Instead of closing our eyes and leaving it to the criminal justice system, we will now address the problems caused by early or abusive cannabis use through awareness, education, and public health. For the millions of honest Canadians who use cannabis recreationally, awareness raising will replace repression. However, for people who do not comply with the legal framework established under the Cannabis Act, the penalties will be very high. The approach being proposed is not naive or stupid. It is finely honed, realistic, and strict.
Whether Canadians can use cannabis or not, they did not wait for our permission. The high prevalence of cannabis use is a given. We could claim, of course, to be wiser and threaten, thou shalt not consume cannabis before age 25 or 21 or 19. Young Canadians would ignore our huffing and puffing like we ignored a lot of what our parents told us. Tonight, we will vote on the best way to deal with recreational cannabis use, not as a possibility, not as a Trudeau government policy, but as a fact. So what do? Do we take a deep breath, close our eyes, and stick with a demonstrably failed, hypocritical, unhealthy, prohibitionist approach of the past? Or do we move forward, eyes wide open, and choose the alternative, a frank, mature policy to which we as senators have brought a significant, sober contribution? I choose the latter. I choose to support Bill C-45 because I'm confident that Canadians can face this issue head-on in a level-headed, responsible, and determined manner. C-45 is not war on drugs, but it is not soft on drugs either. C-45 is a pragmatic approach, one that respects Canadians' intelligence and undertakes to inform them on the risks of cannabis rather than threaten them away from a product that millions legitimately enjoy. Honourable Senators, I choose a new way of doing things over a failed approach. I choose to open my eyes rather than put on blinders. I choose education over criminalization, tough on crime over tough on youth, dialogue over diktats, information over threats. I trust Canadians, especially young Canadians. I am confident that over time, once information and education are fully provided in a safe, legal environment, they will make the right choices. The right choices, not for us, as wise as we think we may be, but the right choices for themselves and